Before we begin this story, I need you to understand something. I need you to look at your phone right now and find the last photo you took of someone you love. A child, parent, a friend, someone who matters. Now I want you to imagine that this single photograph, this one image on your screen could destroy everything you've built. That it could expose a secret so dangerous, so volatile, that powerful people would kill to keep it buried. That's where this story begins. With a photograph. With a mother. And with a collapse that would change two families forever. The rain was falling hard that November night in Philadelphia. The kind of cold rain that seeps through your jacket and reminds you that winter is coming whether you're ready or not. Inside the Meridian restaurant, where entrees started at $60 and the wine list had bottles worth more than most people's monthly rent, the atmosphere was warm, insulated, separate from the harsh reality outside. Crystal chandeliers cast golden light over white tablecloths. Soft jazz played through invisible speakers. The clientele wore watches that cost more than cars and spoke in the hushed tones of people conducting business that couldn't be overheard. Sierra Martinez had been on her feet for 11 hours straight. 28 years old, 5'4", with dark skin that showed every sign of exhaustion and eyes that had stopped believing in easy answers years ago. Her black server's uniform was impeccable. She'd learned early that looking the part was half the battle in places like this, but underneath her body was screaming. Her feet throbbed in shoes that had worn through at the heels. Her lower back sent sharp jolts up her spine every time she bent to clear a table. She'd skipped lunch. Skipped dinner. The last thing she'd eaten was a granola bar at noon. And now it was past 11 and her vision was starting to blur at the edges. She'd almost left 3 hours ago. Almost told her manager that she was done. That she couldn't take another table. Another order. Another smile plastered on while wealthy strangers complained that their steak was overcooked or their wine wasn't properly chilled. But then she'd thought about the eviction notice folded in her purse. $2,400 due in 14 days or she and her daughter Zadie would be on the street. So when her manager asked if she could cover the late shift because someone had called out sick, Sierra said yes. She always said yes. Because that's what you did when you were one paycheck away from homelessness. That's what you did when you were a single mother with no family, no safety net, and a 4-year-old daughter depending on you for everything. In her apron pocket, folded carefully so it wouldn't crease, was a photograph. Zadie at the park last weekend, caught mid-laugh on the swing set, her mixed features, black and Asian, radiant in the autumn sunlight. Her eyes crinkled at the corners just like her father's used to. Her smile, slightly asymmetrical with that left dimple that made Sierra's heart ache every time she saw it. Sierra carried this photo everywhere. On good days, it reminded her why she was working herself into the ground. On bad days, it was the only thing that kept her from walking out and never coming back. She didn't know it yet, but in exactly 4 minutes, that photograph was going to fall out of her pocket. It was going to slide across a hardwood floor and stop at the feet of a man in booth 7. A man who had come to the Meridian that night to discuss territorial disputes and money laundering, and the kind of business that happened in the shadows of cities like Philadelphia. A man who, when he looked down at that photograph, would see a ghost. Would see his dead brother's face staring back at him from the smile of a 4-year-old girl he'd never known existed. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Because first Sierra had to make it through the next 4 minutes. First she had to approach booth 7 one more time. Take one more order, paste on one more smile. First her body, pushed beyond every reasonable limit, had to finally say enough. The room was starting to tilt. Sierra noticed it as she walked toward the kitchen. That subtle shift in perspective that told her something was very wrong. The sounds around her became muffled, distant, like she was underwater. Her hands were shaking. Not a little. Shaking hard enough that the water glasses on her tray were starting to clink together. She could feel sweat beading on her forehead despite the restaurant's perfect climate control. Her heart was racing, but in an uneven, stuttering way that scared her. Dehydration. Exhaustion. Blood sugar crash. Her body had been sending her warning signals for hours, and she'd ignored every one of them because she had no choice. Because stopping meant losing money, meant missing rent, meant putting Zadie at risk. So she'd pushed through. Right up until the moment her body made the decision for her. It happened between the kitchen and table 12. One moment she was moving forward, tray balanced on her shoulder, professional smile ready. The next moment the floor was rushing up to meet her. She tried to catch herself, reached out for something, anything to break her fall. Her fingers scraped against the wall but found no purchase. The tray went flying. Water glasses exploded across the hardwood. And Sierra Martinez, who had survived foster care and homelessness and 4 years of single motherhood, who had fought every day of her life to stay standing, finally collapsed. The sound brought every conversation to a halt. 67 people turned to look at the fallen server, their faces registering varying degrees of concern and annoyance. The manager rushed over, already calculating the liability, the disruption, the cost. 2 servers dropped to their knees beside Sierra, calling her name, checking her pulse. Someone shouted for a doctor. Someone else was already on the phone with 911. And in the chaos, in the moment when everyone was focused on Sierra's unconscious form, her apron pocket tore. The photograph, Zadie's bright, smiling face, slid out onto the floor. It drifted slowly, almost gracefully, carried by some invisible current of displaced air. It traveled 12 feet across the polished hardwood, and came to rest exactly 6 inches from the left shoe of the man in booth 7. Before we dive into what happens next, let me ask you one thing. Where are you watching from right now? Comment below, because your response helps this story reach more people. And if you're feeling the tension, the mystery, hit that subscribe button. Trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. The story is just beginning, and you're not going to want to stop now. Dae Kwon, 34 years old, Harvard Business School graduate, fluent in 5 languages, current head of the Quan family organization, had been having a very different kind of evening. He'd come to the Meridian with 3 associates to discuss a problem that had been escalating for months. A Russian syndicate led by a man named Alexei Volkov had been encroaching on Quan territory. First it was small things, a few street corners, some protection rackets, but it had been growing bolder. Last week they'd made a move on one of the Quan family's legitimate businesses, a shipping company that served as both a real enterprise and a front for less legal operations. It was a direct challenge, a provocation that couldn't be ignored. Dae had been explaining his plan to handle the situation when the server collapsed. He barely glanced up. Violence and chaos were part of his world, but a fainting waitress in an upscale restaurant barely registered. He started to return his attention to the conversation when something on the floor caught his eye. A photograph. Face up. The lighting in the restaurant was perfect for seeing details, and from his angle, Dae could see the image clearly. A little girl, for maybe 5 years old. Biracial, black and Asian features blended in a way that was striking even in a casual photograph. She was midlaugh on a swing, joy radiating from every pixel. It was the kind of photo that parents carried, that they pulled out to show friends, that they looked at when they needed to remember why they worked so hard. Dae almost looked away. But then his brain processed what his eyes had seen, and his entire body went rigid. The conversation around him faded to white noise. His associates were still talking, but he couldn't hear them. Couldn't hear anything except the sudden thundering of his own heartbeat. Because that little girl's face, those eyes, that smile, that asymmetrical left dimple, he knew that face. He'd seen it every day for 18 years until a car accident that wasn't really an accident had taken his brother away. Jin, his older brother, the heir to the Quan family who was supposed to take over when their father died, but who'd been killed 2 years ago in what the police ruled as a drunk driving incident. Except Jin hadn't been drinking. Jin had been murdered, and everyone in their world knew it, even if they could never prove it. Jin, who had been everything Dae wasn't, charismatic, bold, willing to take risks that made their father proud and their mother terrified. Jin, who had died at 32 without children, without a legacy, without leaving anything behind except debt and unfinished business, and a mother who'd been drowning in grief ever since. Except now, looking at this photograph, Dae realized that maybe Jin had left something behind after all. The little girl in the photo had Jin's eyes. The exact shade of brown, the exact shape, the way they crinkled at the corners when she smiled. She had Jin's smile, that same slightly crooked grin that had gotten his brother out of trouble 1,000 times. And that dimple. Dae reached up unconsciously to touch his own left cheek, where he had no dimple, but where Jin had had one in exactly the same spot as this little girl. Genetics didn't lie. Dae had spent enough time around family, had seen enough photographs of Jin at various ages, to recognize his brother's features, even rearranged by mixed heritage and gender. This child was a Quan, which meant she was Jin's daughter. Which meant somewhere in this restaurant was a woman his brother had been with, a woman who'd gotten pregnant and either Jin had never known or he'd known and kept it secret, and either way this changed everything. Dae stood up abruptly. His associates looked at him questioningly but he ignored them. He walked toward the collapsed server and the knot of people surrounding her. Paramedics were already arriving. The Meridian was in an affluent neighborhood where emergency response times were measured in minutes, not hours. They were lifting the unconscious woman onto a stretcher, checking her vitals, asking questions that no one could answer because nobody really knew this server. This woman who worked doubles and kept to herself and was just trying to make rent. Dae bent down smoothly and picked up the photograph. No one noticed. Everyone was focused on the medical emergency. He studied the image more closely now, looking for any other details. The background showed a public park. He could see playground equipment, autumn trees. The photo was recent, taken within the last few weeks based on the fall foliage. The little girl was well-dressed, clean, clearly cared for. And on the back of the photo in feminine handwriting was a name. Zadie, October 2024. Zadie. His niece's name was Zadie. Dae slipped the photograph into his jacket pocket and returned to his table. His associates were watching him with curiosity but knew better than to ask questions when he had that expression on his face. He pulled out his phone and sent a single text message to his head of security. I need complete background on Sierra Martinez, server at the Meridian restaurant. Everything. Employment history, residence, family, especially any children. I need it in 6 hours. Then he sat back down and pretended to continue the conversation about Russian syndicates and territorial disputes. But his mind was elsewhere. His mind was on a little girl named Zadie who had his brother's face. And on a woman named Sierra Martinez who had kept a secret for 4 years. And on his mother who'd been searching desperately for any trace of Jin, who'd spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on private investigators chasing ghosts, who'd slipped deeper into depression with every dead end. If this child was really Jin's daughter, and Dae's instincts, honed by years of reading people and situations, told him she was, then everything was about to change. For his family. For this woman Sierra. And for a 4-year-old girl who had no idea that her father's legacy was written in blood and power and dangerous secrets. But before any of that could happen, before Dae could investigate and confirm and decide what to do with this information, something else was happening. Something that would make this situation infinitely more complicated. Because in a warehouse across town, Alexei Volkov was receiving a very interesting phone call from one of his informants. An informant who had connections in the Meridian's kitchen staff. An informant who just learned that Dae Kwon had picked up a photograph of a little girl and looked at it like he'd seen a ghost. The Russian syndicate had been looking for any weakness in the Quan family organization. Any leverage they could use to force a more favorable negotiation. And a secret grandchild? A child who'd just been discovered, who had no protection in place, who existed outside the Quan family's usual security measures. That wasn't just leverage. That was a weapon. So while Sierra Martinez lay unconscious in an ambulance, while Dae Kwon sat in a restaurant booth processing the revelation that his brother had a daughter, while 4-year-old Zadie slept peacefully in her babysitter's apartment completely unaware that her entire world was about to change, 2 separate groups were already making plans. The Kwons who wanted to protect family they'd just discovered. And the Russians who wanted to exploit it. But we're still at the beginning of this story. Still in those first moments where nothing has been decided and everything is possible. Still in the space where Sierra Martinez is just a woman who collapsed from exhaustion. Where Zadie is just a little girl who looks like her father. Where choices haven't yet been made that can't be unmade. That's about to change. Because when Sierra woke up in the hospital 6 hours later, when she found her phone full of missed calls and one text message from an unknown number, when she realized that someone, a stranger, had paid her medical bills and knew about Zadie, she was going to understand that the careful, controlled life she'd built was over. That the past she'd tried to escape had found her. And that the photograph she'd carried in her pocket, meant to be a source of comfort and strength, had instead become the key to opening a door she'd spent 4 years trying to keep closed. But to understand what happened next, to really understand why Sierra's first instinct when she read that text message was pure terror, we need to go back. We need to understand who Sierra Martinez was before she became a single mother, Before she started working herself into exhaustion at the Meridian, before she found herself tangled in the web of organized crime. We need to go back to Chicago, to 5 years ago, to the night she met a man who called himself Gene Park and said he worked in international business. Sierra had been 23 years old, living in a studio apartment on Chicago's South Side, working 2 jobs, waitressing during the day and bartending at night. She'd aged out of foster care at 18 with $500 and a social worker who wished her luck but had 30 other cases demanding attention. No family. No safety net. No college degree because she couldn't afford tuition and didn't qualify for enough financial aid. Just determination and a work ethic born from knowing that stopping meant starving. She'd been exhausted that night 5 years ago, finishing a double shift at a downtown bar that catered to business professionals. It was one of those upscale places where cocktails cost $18, and the tips were good if you smiled right and laughed at jokes that weren't funny and pretended not to notice when married men slipped off their wedding rings before ordering. Sierra had become expert at the performance, at being whatever version of herself would pay the bills. Gene had come in alone around 10 p.m. She'd noticed him immediately because he didn't fit the usual clientele. Most of the men who came to this bar were white, American, loud with the confidence that came from inherited wealth or corporate success. Gene was different. Korean, probably late 20s or early 30s, wearing an expensive suit that wasn't trying too hard. He sat at the bar instead of taking a table, ordered a whiskey neat without looking at the menu. And when Sierra came to take his order, he'd met her eyes and actually seen her. Not the performance. Her. They talked. Just small talk at first. Where are you from? How long have you lived in Chicago? The kind of meaningless conversation that fills space between strangers. But then real conversation. He'd asked what she was studying, and when she said she wasn't in school, couldn't afford it, he'd nodded like that made sense instead of looking at her with pity. He'd told her he understood working your way up from nothing, that his family had come to America with nothing and built everything from scratch. That success was about determination, not luck. It was a lie, though Sierra wouldn't learn that until much later. Jin's family hadn't built their empire through legitimate business. They'd built it through violence and intimidation and carefully calculated risks. But that night in that bar, with Jin's dark eyes focused on her like she was the only person in the room, Sierra had believed him. Had wanted to believe him. He'd come back the next night. And the night after that. Always alone. Always sitting at the bar where they could talk. After a week, he'd asked her to dinner on her night off. Sierra almost said no. She'd learned early that men who seemed too good to be true usually were. That gifts came with strings and attention came with expectations. But there was something about Gene that felt different. Something genuine beneath the expensive clothes and careful manners. Their first date had been at a Korean restaurant in Lincoln Park. Gene had ordered for both of them, explaining each dish, teaching her how to properly wrap Sam, laughing when she admitted she'd never used chopsticks before and didn't know the first thing about Korean food. He'd been patient, kind, and when he'd walked her to her door at the end of the night and kissed her goodnight without pushing for anything more, Sierra had felt something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. The next 3 months had been the happiest of Sierra's life. Gene took her to restaurants she could never afford on her own. Bought her things. Not in a creepy sugar daddy way, but genuine gifts that showed he'd been paying attention. A warm coat when winter came because he'd noticed her shivering. Books by authors she'd mentioned wanting to read. Small things that meant he was actually listening, actually cared. He made her feel seen. Safe. Like maybe she didn't have to do everything alone anymore. She'd fallen in love with him. Completely. Stupidly. In the way you love someone when you're 23 and have never had anyone choose you before. And Gene had seemed to love her back. He'd told her she was strong, beautiful, that her determination impressed him, that she deserved better than what life had given her. But there were things Sierra noticed. Things that didn't quite add up. Gene was often unavailable with no explanation. He'd disappear for days sometimes, texting apologies about work emergencies that he could never really explain. He'd get phone calls at odd hours and step away to take them, his voice dropping into Korean, his entire demeanor changing. He paid for everything in cash, never used credit cards. And once, when Sierra had playfully reached for his phone to take a selfie of them together, he'd moved it out of her reach with a speed that seemed excessive for someone with nothing to hide. She'd asked him about it. About what exactly his international business involved. About why he seemed to have unlimited money but no regular office or schedule. About why he'd never let her meet any friends or family. Jin had been evasive. Said his work was complicated. That he dealt with sensitive negotiations and confidentiality agreements. That his family was traditional and he wanted to wait for the right time to introduce her. Sierra had wanted to believe him. Had needed to believe him. Because the alternative, that she'd fallen for another man who was using her, that she'd let her guard down and was going to get hurt again, was too painful to consider. So she'd pushed down her doubts and let herself be happy. For 3 months, she'd let herself imagine a future where she wasn't alone anymore. And then one night in January, Jin had come to her apartment at 2 in the morning. She'd been asleep. The knock had startled her awake, and when she opened the door, Jin was there with a duffel bag over his shoulder and something in his eyes she'd never seen before. Fear. He wouldn't explain. Wouldn't answer her questions. Just kept saying he was sorry, that this wasn't her fault, that she deserved better than what he could give her. He'd kissed her one last time, desperate, almost violent in its intensity, and then he was gone. Walking out of her apartment, out of her life, leaving nothing behind except a note that said, "I'm sorry. You deserve better than this life. Please don't try to find me." Sierra had tried anyway. Called his number, disconnected. Went to the restaurant where they'd had their first date. No one had heard of him. Even tried to search for him online. No Gene Park matching his description existed in any database she could access. It was like he'd been a ghost. Like the entire relationship had been something she'd imagined. 2 months later, she'd found out she was pregnant. The discovery had sent Sierra into a panic that lasted weeks. She was 23 years old, barely surviving on her own. No family support. No savings. And now pregnant by a man who disappeared without a trace. She'd considered her options. All of them. Made appointments she'd canceled at the last minute because when it came down to it, she couldn't go through with it. This baby, this accident, this complication, this disaster, was the only family she'd ever have. The only blood connection to another human being that was truly hers. So Sierra had kept the baby. Worked through the pregnancy. Hiding her growing belly under oversized uniforms until she couldn't hide it anymore. Saving every penny for medical bills and baby supplies. She'd moved back to Philadelphia because Chicago held too many memories and a fresh start seemed necessary. Had found a tiny apartment and a waitressing job and somehow made it work. Zadie had been born on a Tuesday morning in July. 7 pounds 3 ounces. Healthy. Perfect. With her father's eyes and her mother's determination written in every cry and kick. And when the nurse had placed that tiny, wrinkled baby in Sierra's arms, when she'd looked down at her daughter's face and seen Jin's features staring back at her, Sierra had made herself a promise. She would protect this child. She would give Zadie everything she herself had never had, stability, safety, love. And she would never let anyone hurt them. For 4 years she'd kept that promise. It hadn't been easy. Single motherhood never was. The money was always tight. The exhaustion was constant. There were nights when Sierra cried in the bathroom after Zadie was asleep, overwhelmed by the weight of doing everything alone. But she'd made it work. Had found a decent daycare. Had gotten better waitressing jobs that paid enough to cover rent most months. Had built a small but stable life where Zadie was happy and safe and loved. And Sierra had never tried to find Jin again. Had convinced herself it was better this way. That whatever life he'd been living, whatever secrets he'd been keeping, Zadie was better off not being part of it. She'd filled out Zadie's birth certificate with father unknown, because it was true. She didn't know who Jin really was. Didn't know his real name or where he'd come from, or whether he was even still alive. She'd accepted that it would always be just the two of them. Mother and daughter against the world. And she'd been okay with that. More than okay. She'd built something real. Something that was hers. Until the night she collapsed at the Meridian restaurant. Until a photograph slipped from her pocket and landed at the feet of a man whose last name was Quan, not Park. Until the past she tried to escape came flooding back with a revelation that would shatter everything she thought she knew about the man she'd loved. Because Jin Park didn't exist. Had never existed. The man Sierra had fallen in love with was Jin Kwon, eldest son of the Quan crime family, heir to an organization built on violence and power and secrets written in blood. And when he disappeared from her life 5 years ago, it wasn't because he didn't love her. It was because loving her had put her in danger. Because anyone associated with the Kwons became a target. Because he'd seen what his world did to innocent people, and he'd chosen to protect her the only way he knew how, by walking away. But Jin hadn't known about Zadie. Hadn't known that his DNA lived on in a little girl with his eyes and his smile and his asymmetrical dimple. And now, 2 years after his death in a car accident that wasn't really an accident, his family had found her. And they wanted what was theirs. Sierra was about to learn all of this. Was about to have her careful, controlled world torn apart by revelations she wasn't ready for. But first, she had to wake up in a hospital room with a text message from a stranger and realize that her daughter, her safe, protected, innocent daughter, had just become visible to people who lived in the shadows. People who protected their family with the same ruthlessness they used to destroy their enemies. People who didn't take no for an answer. The text message was simple, almost polite. Your daughter is safe. Your bills have been taken care of. We need to talk. DK. When Sierra read those words, when she saw that a stranger knew about Zadie, her first instinct wasn't gratitude. It was terror. Because in her experience when powerful people said we need to talk, what they really meant was, you're going to do what I want, and you don't have a choice. And Sierra had spent her entire adult life fighting to have choices. Fighting to control her own destiny. Fighting to protect the one person who mattered more than anything. She was about to discover that some fights you can't win alone. That sometimes protection comes from dangerous places. And that the legacy Jin had left behind wasn't just genetic features and a daughter who looked like him. It was a world that would claim Zadie as its own, whether Sierra wanted it to or not. Sierra woke to fluorescent lights and the steady beep of hospital monitors. Her head throbbed with the specific ache that came from dehydration and exhaustion. Her mouth was dry, tasting of metal and stale air. For a moment, she couldn't remember where she was or how she'd gotten there. Then it came back in fragments, the restaurant, the spinning room, the floor rushing up to meet her. Panic seized her immediately. Zadie. Where was Zadie? Sierra's hands flew to her pockets, searching for her phone. It was on the bedside table, charging, and when she grabbed it with shaking fingers, she saw 17 missed calls from the babysitter and 3 from her manager at the Meridian. But it was the text message from the unknown number that made her blood run cold. Your daughter is safe. Your bills have been taken care of. We need to talk. DK. Someone knew about Zadie. A stranger had accessed her phone, found her emergency contacts, paid her hospital bills. And whoever this DK was, they'd made sure Sierra knew they could reach her daughter whenever they wanted. It was a message wrapped in politeness, but the underlying threat was clear. We know where you are, we know who matters to you, and we're watching. Sierra's first instinct was to run. Pull out the 4, grab her clothes, get to Zadie and disappear. It was the same instinct that had kept her alive through foster care, through homelessness, through every situation where staying had meant more pain. But before she could act on it, a nurse appeared in the doorway. Oh good, you're awake. How are you feeling? The nurse was middle-aged, kind-faced, the type who'd probably chosen this profession because she genuinely cared about people. You gave everyone quite a scare. Dehydration, low blood sugar, exhaustion. When's the last time you had a proper meal? Sierra ignored the question. How long have I been here? About 6 hours. It's 4 in the morning. The nurse checked the monitors, made notes on a tablet. The doctor wants to keep you for observation. Make sure there's no underlying. I need to leave. Sierra was already pulling at the 4 tape on her arm. Ma'am, I really don't think that's. I need to see my daughter. I need to leave now. The nurse's expression shifted to something like understanding mixed with pity. Your daughter is fine. The gentleman who brought you in made sure of that. He called your emergency contact, confirmed your little girl was safe with the babysitter. He even paid your bill so you wouldn't have to worry about. What gentleman? Sierra's voice was sharp now. Who was he? I don't know his name. Asian gentleman, very well dressed. He seemed very concerned about making sure you and your daughter were taken care of. The nurse's expression suggested she thought this was romantic. A good Samaritan helping a woman in need. She had no idea she was describing a predator circling prey. Sierra stopped trying to remove the 4. Her hands were shaking, not from weakness now but from fear. Because she understood what was happening. Someone had been at the restaurant when she collapsed. Someone had found her phone, her emergency contacts. Someone knew about Zadie and had the resources to pay her hospital bills without blinking, which meant someone with serious money. And there was only one person from her past who fit that description. Only one group of people who would have that kind of reach and power. Jin's family had found her. The realization hit Sierra like a physical blow. For 4 years she'd convinced herself they didn't know about Zadie. That Jin had never told them. That they were safe in their anonymity. But if Jin's family had found them, if they knew about his daughter, then everything was about to change. Because from what Sierra remembered of Jin's vague explanations about his family, they were traditional, protective, the kind of people who took care of their own and didn't let outsiders interfere. Zadie was their blood, which meant they would want her, would claim her, would pull her into whatever dark world Jin had been trying to escape. "Ma'am." The nurse was looking at her with concern. "You've gone very pale. Are you feeling faint again?" "I'm fine." Sierra's voice was steady even though nothing about this situation was fine. "When can I be discharged?" "The doctor will make rounds at 8. If everything looks good, probably by noon." 8 hours. 8 hours of sitting in this hospital room, vulnerable and exposed, while some stranger who knew about Zadie could be making plans. 8 hours where she couldn't hold her daughter, couldn't verify she was actually safe, couldn't run. Sierra forced herself to breathe. Forced herself to think strategically instead of panicking. She needed information. Needed to understand who she was dealing with, and what they wanted before she made any moves. Because running blindly with a 4-year-old and no resources would just make them easier to find. "Did he leave a name?" Sierra asked. "The man who brought me in?" The nurse checked her tablet. "It just says friend of the family in the admissions notes. But like I said, he took care of everything. You don't need to worry about the bill." Friend of the family. The phrase would have been laughable if it wasn't so ominous. Sierra pulled her phone close and stared at the text message again. DK. Jin had never mentioned any family members by name. Had been careful to keep those worlds completely separate. But if this was his brother or cousin or uncle, if this was someone from the organization he'd been part of, then Sierra needed to know exactly what she was up against. She typed out a careful response. "Who is this? How do you know about my daughter?" The reply came within seconds, like whoever was on the other end had been waiting for her to wake up, waiting for this conversation. "My name is Dae Kwon. Jin was my brother. We need to talk about his daughter." There it was. Confirmation. Jin Kwon. Not Jin Park. And this person, this Dae, knew that Zadie was Jin's daughter. Which meant they knew about the timing. Knew that Sierra had been pregnant when Jin disappeared. Knew that they had a blood connection to a child they'd never met. Sierra's fingers hovered over the keyboard. 1,000 questions fought for priority. "How did you find me? What do you want? Are you going to try to take my daughter?" But she settled on the most important one. "What do you want from us?" Another immediate response. "Just to talk. I understand you're frightened. I understand you have no reason to trust me. But my mother has been searching for Jin's child for 2 years. That little girl is my niece. She's family. And my family takes care of our own." The words were meant to be reassuring, but they had the opposite effect. Because Sierra understood what family takes care of our own meant in the context of organized crime. It meant control. It meant obligations. It meant that Zadie, just by existing, had become part of something Sierra had spent 4 years trying to keep her from. "I don't want anything from you or your family," Sierra typed back. "We're fine on our own." The response took longer this time, and when it came, the tone had shifted slightly. Still polite, but with an edge that suggested patience had limits. "Ms. Martinez, I respect your independence. But I think you should consider what's best for Zadie. My family has resources that could make her life considerably easier. Education. Security. Opportunities you couldn't provide on a waitress's salary. All we're asking is a chance to meet her. To let my mother see her granddaughter. Surely you can understand that." It was a reasonable request. A grandmother wanting to meet her grandchild. Innocent on the surface. But Sierra could read between the lines. She'd learned early to hear what people weren't saying. This wasn't a request. It was the opening move in a negotiation where Sierra had no leverage. Because they knew where she worked, where she lived, who took care of Zadie during the day. They had all the power. And this polite text conversation was just a courtesy before they took what they wanted. Unless Sierra could figure out a way to get some power of her own. She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she called the babysitter. A college student named Mara who lived in the same apartment building and watched Zadie 3 nights a week. The phone rang 4 times before a sleepy voice answered. Sierra? Oh my God, are you okay? The hospital called and said you collapsed. And then this man called me to make sure Zadie was safe, and I didn't know what to do. Mara, slow down. Is Zadie there? Is she okay? She's fine. She's asleep. She doesn't even know anything happened. But Sierra, who was that man? He knew your name, knew Zadie's name, knew I was the babysitter. It was really weird. Sierra's grip tightened on the phone. What exactly did he say to you? Just that you'd had a medical emergency and he wanted to make sure Zadie was safe. He asked if I needed anything, food, money, whatever. I told him we were fine. Was that okay? Should I have called the police? No, you did the right thing. Sierra's mind was racing. Dae Kwon had made sure to establish himself as concerned and helpful, not threatening. It was a smart move. Made him seem like the good guy. Made Sierra seem paranoid if she tried to keep him away. Listen, I'm going to be discharged soon. Can you stay with Zadie until I get there? Of course. Sierra, what's going on? Are you in trouble? That was the question, wasn't it? Was she in trouble, or was this actually an opportunity? Because the truth was, Sierra had been one emergency away from disaster for years. One missed paycheck from eviction. One illness from bankruptcy. She'd been fighting so hard just to survive that she'd never had space to imagine anything better. And now someone was offering resources, security, opportunities. All it would cost was bringing Zadie into a world where violence was currency and loyalty was enforced with blood. I don't know yet, Sierra answered honestly. But I'm going to figure it out. Just keep the door locked and don't let anyone in until I get there. Okay? After she hung up, Sierra stared at her phone for a long moment. She could ignore the text message. Could discharge herself from the hospital, grab Zadie and run. Pack what they could carry and disappear the way she'd learned to disappear in foster care. New city, new names, new life. It would be hard, maybe impossible with a 4-year-old, but she'd survived worse. Or she could respond. Could agree to meet this Dae Kwon and find out exactly what she was dealing with. Could gather information before making a decision. Because running blindly wouldn't protect Zadie if these people were determined to find them. And if they really were Jin's family, if they really just wanted a relationship with their granddaughter, maybe there was a way to manage it. To set boundaries. To take what resources they offered without letting them take control. Sierra typed out a careful response. I'll meet with you. Once. Just to talk. But Zadie doesn't meet anyone until I understand what's happening. And if I decide this isn't good for her, you leave us alone. The response was immediate. That's fair. When you're discharged, a car will be waiting to take you wherever you want to go. No pressure. No obligations. Just a conversation. Thank you for being willing to listen, Ms. Martinez. Sierra didn't respond. She set the phone down and stared at the ceiling, trying to quiet the panic in her chest. She just agreed to meet with someone from Jin's world. Someone who probably knew things about Jin that she'd never learned in their 3 months together. Someone who could answer questions she'd stopped asking years ago because the answers didn't matter anymore. Except now they did matter. Because Zadie wasn't just Sierra's daughter anymore. She was Jin Kwon's daughter. She was a granddaughter, a niece, an heir to something Sierra didn't fully understand. And whether Sierra liked it or not, that meant something. That changed things. The next 4 hours passed in a blur of medical checks and insurance paperwork. The doctor cleared her for discharge with strict instructions to rest, hydrate, and not return to work for at least 3 days. Sierra nodded and agreed to everything while mentally calculating how many shifts she'd have to miss, how far behind on rent that would put her, whether she could pick up extra hours next week to compensate. At 8:30 in the morning, wearing the same uniform she'd collapsed in, now wrinkled and stained from the fall, Sierra walked out of the hospital into weak November sunlight. True to the text message, there was a car waiting. Not a limousine or anything ostentatious. Just a black sedan with tinted windows and a driver who opened the back door for her without speaking. Sierra hesitated. Getting into that car felt like a point of no return. Like once she crossed this line, she couldn't go back to pretending her life was her own. But what choice did she have? They knew where she lived. They knew about Zadie. Running would just delay the inevitable. She got in the car. The driver pulled away from the hospital smoothly, heading toward her apartment in South Philadelphia. Sierra watched the city pass by the tinted windows. Everything familiar but somehow alien now. Like she was seeing it from the other side of a divide she hadn't known existed. The world of people who struggled to survive, and the world of people who made phone calls and paid hospital bills and sent cars without blinking. Miss Martinez. The driver's voice was polite, professional. Mr. Quan asked me to give you this. He handed back an envelope. Sierra opened it with shaking fingers and found $500 in cash and a note written in precise masculine handwriting. For the shifts you'll miss recovering. This isn't payment for anything. Just making sure you can rest without worrying. DK. $500. Enough to cover her share of rent with some left over. Given casually like it was nothing. And maybe to someone like Dae Kwon it was nothing. But to Sierra it represented 2 weeks of work. 2 weeks of being on her feet for hours, of smiling through exhaustion, of choosing between eating lunch and saving money. She should have been grateful. Should have felt relieved that this stranger was helping her. Instead she felt trapped. Because this was how it worked in that world. First came the gifts, the help, the generosity. Then came the expectations. The obligations. The slow realization that nothing was free and every favor came with strings attached. But Sierra pocketed the money anyway. Because she needed it. Because Zadie needed it. Because pride was a luxury she couldn't afford. The car pulled up outside her apartment building. A rundown 3-story walk-up in a neighborhood that was trying to gentrify but hadn't quite gotten there yet. Sierra's apartment was on the 2nd floor. A 1-bedroom that she and Zadie shared because that's what she could afford. The building had thin walls and unreliable heat, and a landlord who took weeks to fix anything. But it was theirs. It was home. Mr. Quan will be in touch about meeting, the driver said as Sierra got out. He appreciates your willingness to talk. Sierra didn't respond. She just took the envelope of cash and walked toward her building, feeling the weight of invisible eyes watching her. Knowing that from this moment on, her life was different. Knowing that she just stepped into something she didn't fully understand and might not be able to control. When she opened her apartment door, Mara jumped up from the couch where she'd been watching TV with the volume low. Sierra. Thank God. I was so worried. I'm fine. Sierra moved past her straight to the bedroom, where Zadie was still asleep in the double bed they shared. 4 years old, tangled in blankets, one arm thrown over her head in that way she'd slept since she was a baby. She looked exactly like Jin in that moment, the shape of her face, the way her hair fell across her forehead. Sierra had trained herself not to see it most days, but now it was all she could see. This child was a Quan. This child was part of a family Sierra had never known existed. Did anything else happen? Sierra asked Mara without taking her eyes off Zadie. Any other calls, anyone coming by? No, nothing. We just stayed in like you said. Sierra, seriously, what's going on? That man on the phone, he didn't sound threatening, but something about it felt off. Sierra pulled the envelope of cash from her pocket and handed Mara $200. For staying overnight. And for not asking questions. Mara stared at the money. This is way too much. I was happy to help. Take it. Please. And Mara? If anyone else calls asking about me or Zadie, anyone at all, you tell them you don't know anything. Okay. The college student's eyes widened with understanding that this was serious, even if she didn't know why. Okay. I won't say anything. But Sierra, if you need help, if you're in some kind of trouble, I'll figure it out. I always do. After Mara left, Sierra sat on the edge of the bed and watched Zadie sleep. She thought about Jin, about the man she'd loved who'd turned out to be someone completely different. She thought about the choice she was facing. Accept help from his family and risk losing control of her life, or refuse and struggle alone with the knowledge that they were out there, watching, waiting. But mostly she thought about Zadie, about what kind of life she could give her daughter on her own versus what the Kwons could provide. About whether it was selfish to keep Zadie from family just because Sierra was afraid. About whether protection from dangerous people was worth accepting protection from different dangerous people. There were no good answers. Just choices that came with different costs. Sierra's phone buzzed with another text. I know you need time. Take a few days to rest, to think about things. When you're ready to talk, I'll be here. In the meantime, if you or Zadie need anything at all, please let me know. Family takes care of family. DK. Family takes care of family. The phrase that was meant to be comforting but felt like a chain wrapping around her. Because Zadie was family to them now. Which meant they had claim to her. Which meant Sierra's careful control over her daughter's life, her fierce protection of the small world they built, was already slipping away. She didn't respond to the text. Instead, she climbed into bed next to Zadie and pulled her daughter close, breathing in the smell of her hair, feeling the steady rhythm of her breathing. For now they were safe. For now Zadie was still just her little girl, untouched by the revelations that were coming. But Sierra knew it couldn't last. Knew that sooner or later she would have to make a choice. And whatever she chose, nothing would ever be the same. What Sierra couldn't know, was that while she was lying in that bed trying to figure out her next move, Dae Kwon was sitting in his office 30 minutes away making moves of his own. He'd already ordered a DNA test using a strand of hair his driver had collected from Zadie's car seat during the night. Already had investigators pulling every piece of information they could find about Sierra Martinez. Employment history, credit score, social connections, medical records. Already had his security team identifying potential threats. Because if his family had found Jin's daughter, it was only a matter of time before their enemies did too. And in a warehouse across town, Alexei Volkov was looking at a photograph his informant had sent him. A photograph of a little girl on a swing, smiling at the camera with eyes that looked exactly like Jin Kwon's. A photograph that represented leverage, weakness, opportunity. The Russians had been looking for a way to hurt the Quans, to force them into negotiations on terms favorable to the Volkov organization. And now they'd found it. A secret granddaughter, unprotected, vulnerable. A child who existed outside the normal Quan security measures, because no one had known she existed until now. Alexei sent a simple text to his second-in-command. Find out everything about this child and her mother. Where they live, where the child goes to school, who watches her. I want surveillance in place by tomorrow. And keep it quiet. The Quans can't know we know until we're ready to make our move. The pieces were moving into position. Sierra Martinez thought she had time to make a decision. Time to figure out what was best for her daughter. But time was already running out. Because 3 separate groups were now focused on Zadie, the Quans who wanted to protect her, Sierra who wanted to keep her safe and separate, and the Russians who wanted to use her. And when those forces collided, when the careful balance Sierra had built finally collapsed, the choice would be made for her. The only question was who would be left standing when it was over. 3 days later, Sierra Martinez sat in an upscale tea house in Rittenhouse Square trying not to feel completely out of place. The establishment was the kind of place she'd never been to as a customer. All white tablecloths and fine china and servers who moved with the quiet efficiency of people who knew their customers could buy and sell them without thinking twice. Sierra wore the nicest outfit she owned. A simple black dress she bought at a thrift store for job interviews, and still felt like everyone could see exactly what she was. A waitress. Someone who served people like this, not someone who belonged among them. She'd left Zadie with Mara again. This time with explicit instructions not to leave the apartment and not to answer the door for anyone. The past 3 days had been agonizing. Sierra jumping at every unexpected noise, checking and rechecking the locks, barely sleeping. She kept expecting someone to show up and try to take Zadie, kept imagining scenarios where she came home and her daughter was just gone, taken by people with more power and resources than Sierra could ever fight. But no one had come. Dae Kwon had kept his word about giving her space. The only contact had been a single text yesterday. My mother would like to meet you. Just the 2 of you, public place, no pressure. Would you be willing? She needs to know if her granddaughter exists. Sierra had stared at that message for an hour before responding. A grandmother wanting to meet, wanting to know about her son's child. It sounded innocent. Normal. But nothing about this situation was normal. Still, Sierra had agreed because she needed to understand what she was dealing with. Needed to look these people in the eye and figure out if they were a threat or an opportunity or both. Now, sitting at a corner table with her back to the wall, A habit from years of being careful, being aware. Sierra watched the entrance and tried to steady her breathing. She was early, had arrived 20 minutes before the scheduled meeting, because she'd wanted time to scope out the location, to have an escape route planned. Old survival instincts that had kept her safe when she had nothing and no one. At exactly 2 o'clock, a woman entered the tea house. Mid-60s, Korean, elegantly dressed in expensive but understated clothes. Her hair was perfectly styled, her makeup subtle but precise. She moved with the kind of confidence that came from a lifetime of being deferred to, being important. But there was something else in her bearing too. A weight, a sadness that no amount of expensive clothing could hide. Mrs. Quan spotted Sierra immediately, as if she'd been given a description, and her face did something complicated. A flash of emotion too quick for Sierra to interpret, then careful control sliding back into place. She walked to the table with slow, measured steps, and Sierra realized the older woman was as nervous as she was. "Miss Martinez." Mrs. Kwan's voice was soft, accented but clear. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me. I know this must be difficult." Sierra didn't stand, didn't offer her hand. Just watched as Mrs. Quan sat down across from her, watched as Jin's mother, because that's who this was, the woman who'd raised the man Sierra had loved, folded her hands on the table like she was trying to keep them from shaking. "I don't know what you want from us," Sierra said without preamble. "No point in pretending this was a social call. But I need you to understand something. I've been raising Zadie alone for 4 years. We've built a life. We're fine. We don't need." "She has his eyes," Mrs. Quan interrupted, her voice breaking slightly. "In the photograph Dae showed me. She has Jin's eyes. His smile. Even from a picture I could see it. Could see my son in her face." Sierra felt something crack in her chest at the raw grief in the older woman's voice. She'd prepared for threats, for manipulation, for power plays. She hadn't prepared for this. A mother's pain at losing her child, at discovering that child had left something behind. "I don't know what Jin told you about our family," Mrs. Quan continued, regaining some composure. "What he told you about the life we live. But I imagine it wasn't much. Jin was good at keeping secrets, at protecting people he cared about by keeping them separate from his world." "He told me nothing," Sierra said flatly. "He said he worked in international business and his family was traditional. Then he disappeared in the middle of the night with a note saying I deserved better. That's all I know." Mrs. Kwan's expression shifted to something like pain mixed with understanding. "That sounds like Jin. He always thought he could protect people by keeping them away, by carrying everything alone." She paused, seemed to gather herself. "My son was killed 2 years ago, Ms. Martinez. Not in a car accident like the police reported. He was murdered. And the people who killed him did it because he was a Quan, because of the world we live in. The world he was trying to protect you from." Sierra's hands clenched under the table. She'd suspected Jin was dead. He would have come back if he was alive, would have tried to find her eventually. But hearing it confirmed, hearing that he'd been murdered, brought back all the complicated grief she'd pushed down when she'd chosen to move forward alone. "I'm sorry for your loss," Sierra said, and meant it. "But that doesn't explain what you want from us now." "I want to know my granddaughter." Mrs. Kwan's voice was steady now, direct. "I want to see my son's face in hers. I want to be part of her life, to give her the things Jin would have wanted her to have. Family, heritage, connection to where she comes from." "And what does that cost?" Sierra asked. "Because I've learned that nothing is free. Especially not in your world." For the first time, Mrs. Quan smiled slightly, and Sierra saw where Jin had gotten his ability to read people, to understand what they weren't saying. "You're smart to be suspicious. Yes, there would be costs. Not financial, we have more money than we could spend in 10 lifetimes. But costs nonetheless. Association with our family brings danger. Brings attention from people who would use a child to hurt us. Brings obligations and expectations, and a life very different from what you've been giving her. Then why would I possibly agree to it?" Sierra's voice was sharp. "Why would I bring my daughter into danger just so you can feel closer to your dead son?" The words were harsh, maybe too harsh, but Mrs. Quan didn't flinch. "Because the danger exists whether you acknowledge us or not. Because the moment Dae saw that photograph, the moment he realized Jin had a child, that information became known. And in our world, information spreads. Our enemies will learn about Zadie eventually, if they haven't already. And when they do, she becomes a target whether you're working with us or not. The only question is whether she has our protection when that happens, or whether you're facing it alone. Sierra felt ice slide down her spine because she understood immediately that Mrs. Quan was right. The secret was out. Zadie's existence was known. And Sierra, with her apartment that barely locked properly and her waitress job and her complete lack of resources to deal with actual threats, couldn't protect her daughter from the kind of people Mrs. Quan was talking about. So this is you telling me I don't have a choice? Sierra's voice was flat. Either I let you into our lives or you can't protect us. That's extortion. That's reality. Mrs. Quan leaned forward slightly. Ms. Martinez, Sierra, I know you think we're trying to take your daughter from you, that we're going to swoop in with our money and power and push you aside. But that's not what this is. I don't want to replace you. I don't want to take Zadie from the mother who's loved and raised her. I just want a chance to know her, to be part of her life. And yes, in exchange I can offer things you can't: security, education, opportunities. Is that really so terrible? Sierra wanted to say yes. Wanted to throw this offer back in Mrs. Quan's face and walk out. But she couldn't. Because the truth was she'd been barely surviving for 4 years. One emergency away from disaster. One missed paycheck from homelessness. She'd given Zadie love and stability and everything she could. But it was never enough. There was always more Zadie needed. More Sierra couldn't provide. And now someone was offering more. Offering safety and resources and family. All Sierra had to do was admit she couldn't do this alone. Had to give up the fierce independence that had kept her alive, and let these dangerous people into their lives. I need to think about it, Sierra said finally. I need time to. She stopped mid-sentence because Mrs. Quan's phone was ringing. The older woman glanced at it, and her face went pale. She answered in rapid Korean, her voice rising with each word. Sierra didn't understand the language, but she understood the tone. Fear. Urgency. Panic. Mrs. Quan ended the call and stood abruptly. We need to leave. Now. What? Why? Dae just got word that Russian operatives have identified your apartment building. They've been surveilling you for the past 2 days. Sierra, where is Zadie right now? The bottom dropped out of Sierra's world. She's home. With the babysitter. What do you mean Russian operatives? What the hell is? But Mrs. Quan was already moving. Already pulling out her phone to make another call. Sierra grabbed her purse and followed. Her heart hammering so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. Russian operatives. Surveilling her apartment. Zadie was there right now, unprotected, vulnerable, and Sierra was here drinking tea with a woman she barely knew. They burst out of the tea house together. A black SUV was already pulling up to the curb. How had it gotten there so fast? And Mrs. Quan was pulling Sierra toward it. Dae's sending security to your apartment. But we need to get there. We need to get to Zadie before. Before what? Sierra's voice was breaking. Before what? What do these people want with my daughter? Mrs. Quan's face as she climbed into the SUV was answer enough. Whatever the Russians wanted, it wasn't good. And Sierra had been sitting in a tea house debating choices while her daughter was in danger. While people she didn't even know existed were watching her little girl. Planning something Sierra couldn't even imagine. The drive to South Philadelphia took 15 minutes that felt like hours. Mrs. Quan made call after call in Korean, her voice tight with strain. Sierra called Mara and got voicemail. Called again. And again. Nothing. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold the phone. She's not answering. Sierra's voice was high, panicked. Why isn't she answering? If something happened to Zadie, if they... We'll get there in time, Mrs. Quan said. But even she didn't sound convinced. The SUV screeched to a halt outside Sierra's building. Before it had fully stopped, Sierra was out and running. Up the stairs 2 at a time, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her mind spinning with every worst-case scenario. The door to her apartment was closed. Locked. That was good, right? That meant Mara had followed instructions, had kept everything secure. Sierra's hands fumbled with her keys. Got the door open. Rushed inside calling. Zadie? Mara. The apartment was empty. Not just empty, ransacked. Drawers pulled open. Cushions torn from the couch. And on the floor by the door, Mara's phone, screen cracked like it had been dropped or thrown. Sierra's legs gave out. She collapsed against the wall. A sound coming from her throat that didn't sound human. Because her daughter was gone. Taken. By people who knew exactly what they were doing, who'd waited until Sierra was away, who'd planned this. Mrs. Quan was on the phone again, shouting in Korean. Within seconds, Dae burst through the door with 3 other men. He took one look at the apartment and his face went hard as stone. How long ago? He demanded. I don't know, Sierra gasped. We left 2 hours ago. She's not answering. Where's my daughter? Where the fuck is my daughter? Dae was already working his phone, pulling up something. We have trackers on your building. Let me check the footage. He stopped. Stared at his screen. A white van. 20 minutes ago. 3 men. They were in and out in under 5 minutes. Can you track it? Mrs. Quan asked. Already on it. They're heading toward the docks. Industrial area. Dae looked at Sierra, and for the first time, she saw something like regret in his eyes. The Russians took her. This is my fault. We should have had security on her already. We should have. I don't care whose fault it is. Sierra stood up. Pushed past the grief and terror to something colder, harder. I care about getting her back. So tell me what we're going to do. Tell me how we get my daughter back from these people. Dae and Mrs. Quan exchanged a look. Some kind of silent communication that Sierra didn't fully understand, but whose meaning was clear enough. This was bad. This was the worst-case scenario they'd been trying to prevent. We'll get her back, Dae said. I promise you we will get her back. But Sierra, you need to understand, the Russians don't just want to hurt us. They want leverage. Information they think Zadie can help them access. They're not going to hurt her, not yet. But we need to move carefully. If we go in wrong, if we spook them, then let's not spook them. Sierra's voice was steel. Tell me what we need to do. Tell me how I help get my daughter back. This was it. The moment where everything changed. Where Sierra Martinez, who'd spent 4 years keeping her daughter separate from Jin's world, who'd built walls between them and the Quans, who'd believed she could protect Zadie alone, finally understood the truth. She couldn't do this alone. She'd never been able to do this alone. And now, because she'd waited, because she'd hesitated, because she'd put pride and fear ahead of accepting help, her daughter had been taken by people who lived in shadows and dealt in violence. But Sierra understood something else too. Something that crystallized in that moment as she stood in her ransacked apartment with Jin's family surrounding her. She understood that she would do anything, absolutely anything, to get Zadie back. Would work with criminals, would compromise every principle, would become exactly what she'd always feared if that's what it took. Because that's what mothers did. They protected their children, no matter the cost. Tell me the plan, Sierra said today, and tell me how I fit into it. Because I'm not sitting on the sidelines while someone else rescues my daughter. I'm coming with you. And we're bringing her home. The next 6 hours were the longest of Sierra's life. Dae's people had tracked the white van to a warehouse near the port of Philadelphia, one of dozens of abandoned industrial buildings that dotted the waterfront. The Russians weren't trying to hide, they wanted the Quans to know where they were, wanted them to come. This was about making a point, establishing dominance, showing that they could reach into Quan territory and take whatever they wanted. Sierra sat in the back of an SUV parked 3 blocks from the warehouse, listening to Dae and his security team plan the extraction. They spoke in a mix of English and Korean, their voices calm and professional, like they did this kind of thing regularly. Maybe they did. Sierra didn't know and didn't care. All she cared about was the grainy video feed on a tablet showing the inside of the warehouse, and the small figure of Zadie sitting in a chair, looking scared but unharmed. She's okay, Mrs. Quan said quietly, sitting beside Sierra. The older woman hadn't left her side since they'd discovered Zadie was gone. Look, she's not hurt. They're keeping their distance. They know that if they harm her, there's no negotiation possible. Sierra couldn't speak, could barely breathe, because seeing her daughter on that screen, seeing her scared and alone in a place Sierra couldn't reach, was destroying her from the inside out. This was her fault. She brought this danger into their lives by loving Jin, by carrying his child, by existing in a way that made her daughter valuable to people who dealt in violence and leverage. We should just call the police, Sierra said for the third time. They have my daughter. That's kidnapping. We call the police, they go in, they get her back. And then what? Dae's voice was patient but firm. The Russians have lawyers, Sierra. Good ones. They'll claim it was a misunderstanding, that they were protecting Zadie from an unfit mother, that they were concerned about her welfare. By the time the legal system sorts it out, they'll have moved her somewhere we can't find. And they'll have established that you can't protect her, that you need someone else to step in. Is that what you want? Sierra wanted to scream that no, that wasn't what she wanted, but none of this was what she wanted. She wanted to go back in time to before she'd met Jin. Before she'd fallen in love with a man whose world was darkness and danger. Before she brought a child into this nightmare. But she couldn't go back. Could only go forward. Could only make choices with the cards she'd been dealt. So what's your plan? Sierra asked. You go in shooting? Risk my daughter getting caught in crossfire. No shooting unless absolutely necessary. Dae pulled up a blueprint of the warehouse on another tablet. We know the layout. We have people in position. The Russians are expecting us to come in aggressively, but we're not going to give them what they expect. We're going to negotiate. Negotiate with what? You said they want information Jin hid. We don't have that information. Dae's expression shifted to something complicated. Actually, we do. Or rather, we know where it is. Jin left behind access to financial records that could destroy half the Russian operations on the East Coast. He hid it in a way that requires biometric verification, fingerprints, retinal scan, DNA markers. He did it that way specifically so no one could access it after he died. But Zadie has his DNA, Sierra finished, understanding washing over her like ice water. That's what they want. They want to use my daughter to access whatever Jin hid. And once they have it, they don't need her anymore. The implication hung in the air. Once Zadie served her purpose, she became a liability. A witness. Someone who could identify the people who'd taken her. In the world these people lived in, liabilities didn't survive long. We're not going to let that happen, Mrs. Quan said firmly. Dae has a plan. Tell her. Dae set down the tablet and looked Sierra directly in the eye. We offer them a trade. Not Zadie, we'd never use her like that. But me. I'm Jin's brother. I have the same genetic markers. I can access whatever Jin hid just as easily as Zadie can. So we offer them me in exchange for her. Once Zadie's safe, once she's away from there, we deal with the Russians. Deal with them how? Sierra demanded. However we need to. Dae's voice was flat, emotionless. This is war, Sierra. They declared it when they took a child. So we end it. Permanently. Sierra looked at this man, Jin's brother, Zadie's uncle, and saw something she'd never seen in Jin. Jin had tried to hide what he was, tried to protect her from the violence and darkness. But Dae wasn't hiding, wasn't pretending. He was showing her exactly what he was willing to do, what it would cost to get Zadie back, and letting her decide if she could live with that cost. Will you kill them? Sierra asked directly. The people who took my daughter? If that's what it takes to make sure they never threaten her again? Yes. No hesitation. No apology. Just fact. Sierra thought about the woman she'd been a week ago. The woman who believed violence was always wrong. That there were rules everyone followed. That the system would protect her if she just worked hard enough and stayed quiet. That woman was gone. That woman had died the moment she'd walked into her apartment and found her daughter missing. Okay, Sierra said. What do you need me to do? The plan was simple but risky. Dae would approach the warehouse under a flag of truce, offering himself as a substitute for Zadie. The Russians would likely accept because Dae was more valuable than a 4-year-old. He had authority, knowledge, access to Quan resources. While they were focused on the negotiation, Sierra would approach from a different angle with 2 of Dae's security team. The Russians were watching the main entrance, watching for an obvious rescue attempt. They wouldn't expect a mother in a waitress uniform to slip through the shadows. You don't have to do this, Mrs. Quan said as they prepared. You can wait here. Let us handle it. She's my daughter, Sierra said simply. I should have been there to protect her. I wasn't. So I'm going to be there to bring her home. They moved out as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the industrial wasteland. Sierra followed 2 men she didn't know through abandoned lots and around rusted machinery. her heart hammering so hard she thought everyone could hear it. They'd given her a radio earpiece so she could hear what was happening. Hear Dae as he approached the main entrance. His voice crackled through. I'm here to make a deal. My niece for me. That's the trade. A Russian-accented voice responded. Why would we make this trade? We have what we need. You have a 4-year-old who can't even spell her own name yet. You think she's going to cooperate with retinal scans and fingerprint readers? She'll be terrified, uncooperative. It'll take you days to get what you need. And every day you have her is another day you're at war with my family. But I can give you what Jin hid right now. Immediate access. And then we're done. You have what you want, I get my niece back, and we go our separate ways. There was a pause. Sierra was close enough to the warehouse now that she could see through a broken window on the second floor. Could see Zadie in that chair, her face tear-stained but defiant. Her daughter was scared, but she wasn't giving them the satisfaction of seeing her completely broken. Sierra's heart swelled with pride even as terror threatened to overwhelm her. Acceptable, the Russian voice said finally. But the girl stays until we verify the information is accurate. Insurance. Then we have no deal. The girl leaves first. I stay as insurance. You know I'm worth more as a hostage anyway. Another pause. Sierra watched through the window as men in the warehouse consulted with each other. Finally. Fine. The girl walks out with your people. You stay. But if this is a trick, if the information isn't accurate, we kill you. Understood. Understood. Sierra's security escort signaled her. This was it. The moment when Dae walked into the warehouse and she had to be in position. She climbed through the broken second-floor window as quietly as she could, her hands shaking, her breath coming too fast. Below she could hear Dae entering, could hear the Russians' voices. And then she heard Zadie. Uncle Dae. Her daughter's voice was high, scared. Zadie had never met Dae before, but Mrs. Quan had shown her pictures during those phone calls, had told her about Jin's brother. Smart. It gave them a connection, a reason for Zadie to trust him. It's okay, sweetheart. Dae's voice was gentle. Your mom sent me. We're going to get you home. Sierra moved through the shadows of the second floor, following hand signals from the security team. They could see everything from up here. Dae in the center of the warehouse floor, 5 Russians surrounding him, and Zadie being released from the chair by a 6th man. The little girl ran to Dae immediately, wrapped her arms around his legs. He bent down to whisper something to her that Sierra couldn't hear. The girl leaves now, Dae said. Send her out with my driver. Once she's clear, we proceed. One of the Russians grabbed Zadie's arm. Sierra almost lost it then, almost abandoned the plan and rushed down screaming. But one of her escorts gripped her shoulder hard, keeping her in place. Zadie was walking toward the exit. She was scared, confused, but she was moving. She was going to be okay. Except something went wrong. Sierra saw it happen like it was in slow motion. One of the Russians' phones rang. He answered, listened, and his face changed. He shouted something in Russian. The man holding Zadie's arm pulled her back roughly. Zadie cried out in pain and fear. They know, the Russian leader said. Our people just got word that Quan operatives are surrounding this building. This was a setup. Dae's expression didn't change. Of course I have people surrounding the building. Did you really think I'd walk in here alone? But they won't move as long as you honor the deal. Let the girl go. I stay. Everyone gets what they want. Everyone except us. You think once the girl is safe, once there's no leverage, your people won't storm in here? You think we're stupid. I think you're smart enough to know that killing a 4-year-old child accomplishes nothing except ensuring my family hunts every single one of you to the ends of the earth. Dae's voice was calm, but there was steel underneath. Let her go. Keep me. Or this ends badly for everyone. The Russians were arguing among themselves now in their own language. Sierra could see Zadie crying. Could see her daughter looking around frantically, like she was trying to find her mother. It took everything Sierra had not to call out, not to reveal her position. And then one of the Russians pulled a gun. New plan, he said. We keep both of you. The girl gives us access to Jin's information. You give us leverage against your family. And if anyone tries to stop us. He didn't get to finish the sentence because that's when Sierra's security team made their move. Smoke grenades crashed through windows. The warehouse filled with thick gray smoke. Shouts and gunfire erupted. Sierra couldn't see anything, could barely breathe, but she moved on instinct. Down the metal stairs. Toward where she'd last seen Zadie. Toward her daughter. Zadie. She was screaming now, didn't care about stealth or plans. Zadie, where are you? Mommy. That tiny voice through the chaos. Sierra followed it. Crawled through smoke and debris. Her hands found small shoulders. Zadie. Safe. She pulled her daughter into her arms. Held her so tight the little girl squeaked. I've got you, baby. I've got you. Close your eyes and hold on. Someone was pulling them toward the exit. Sierra couldn't see who, could barely see anything. More gunfire. Shouting in Korean and Russian and English. Then fresh air. They were outside. Someone was pushing them into an SUV. Mrs. Quan was there. Reaching for Zadie, checking her for injuries. Where's Dae? Sierra gasped. He's coming. Mrs. Quan stopped, her face going white. Sierra turned to look back at the warehouse. The smoke was clearing. She could see figures moving, fighting. And then she saw Dae backing toward the exit, covering their escape. Saw him go down when someone tackled him from behind. We have to go back, Sierra said. We can't leave him. We're not. Mrs. Kwan's voice was hard. She was on her phone barking orders in Korean. But you and Zadie need to be far away from here. Now, this is going to get worse before it gets better. The SUV was already moving. Sierra held Zadie in her lap, checking her daughter for injuries even though she seemed physically fine. Scared, traumatized, but not hurt. That's what mattered. That's all that mattered. Mommy, I was so scared. Zadie was crying. Those men said they knew my daddy. Said they were going to take me somewhere to find his secrets. They lied, baby. They were bad people. But you're safe now. I promise you're safe. But even as Sierra said it, she knew it wasn't entirely true. Because this wasn't over. The Russians had declared war, had shown they were willing to target a child. And until that threat was eliminated completely, until every person responsible was dealt with, Zadie would never be truly safe. They drove for 20 minutes, taking a winding route to make sure they weren't followed. Finally pulled up to a building Sierra didn't recognize. A high-rise in Center City. Mrs. Quan led them to a penthouse apartment with security guards at every entrance. You'll stay here tonight, Mrs. Quan said. Both of you. It's secure. No one can get to you here. Sierra wanted to argue, wanted to insist they could go back to their own apartment. But their apartment had been ransacked. Violated. And Sierra was exhausted, traumatized. Running on nothing but adrenaline and terror. So she nodded. Let Mrs. Quan show them to a bedroom. Let her daughter finally collapse into real sleep while Sierra sat beside her. Hand on Zadie's chest to feel her breathing. To confirm she was real and safe and alive. Hours later, past midnight, Mrs. Quan came to the bedroom door. Dae is back. He's in the living room if you want to talk. Sierra looked at Zadie, still sleeping, peaceful despite everything, and made a decision. She needed to know. Needed to understand what had happened after they'd left, what the cost of her daughter's freedom had been. Dae was sitting on the couch when Sierra came out, a glass of whiskey in his hand and blood on his shirt. Not his blood, Sierra realized. His face was bruised, but otherwise he seemed fine. Physically, at least. Thank you, Sierra said simply. For getting her back. For risking yourself. Dae looked up at her, and his eyes were different than they'd been before. Harder. More distant. Like he'd done things in that warehouse that couldn't be undone. She's family. You don't thank family for doing what's necessary. What happened? After we left. We handled it. That was all he said, but Sierra understood. The Russians who'd taken Zadie, who'd threatened her, who'd declared war on the Quans, they'd been handled. Permanently. And Dae had been the one to do it. Sierra should have felt horror. Should have been appalled that violence had been done in her daughter's name. But all she felt was a fierce, primal satisfaction. They'd threatened her child. And now they couldn't threaten anyone ever again. Is it over? Sierra asked. The threat. For now. Volkov lost 5 men tonight, including his second in command. He'll pull back, regroup. We've sent word through channels that Zadie is off limits. That anyone who touches her signs their own death warrant. It's the closest thing to safe we can offer. The closest thing. Sierra laughed without humor. A week ago, I thought keeping her safe meant working double shifts and paying rent on time. Now I'm hearing about death warrants and wondering if my daughter will ever have a normal life. She won't, Dae said bluntly. Not if she stays connected to this family. The danger will always be there. Different faces, different threats, but always something. That's the cost of being a Quan. He paused. But it comes with benefits too. Protection. Resources. The certainty that if anyone ever threatens her again, they'll regret it. Sierra sat down in the chair across from him. Jin tried to protect me by staying away, by keeping his world separate from mine. But it didn't work. Because Zadie exists. And she connects us whether we want to be connected or not. Jin always thought he could control everything by keeping it compartmentalized, Dae said. That if he just stayed away from the people he loved, he could keep them safe. But he didn't understand that DNA doesn't respect boundaries. That blood ties don't disappear because you ignore them. What would he want for her? Sierra asked quietly. If he knew she existed, what would he want? Dae was quiet for a long moment. He'd want her to be better than us. To have choices he never had. He'd want her to know her heritage but not be defined by it. To understand where she comes from without being trapped by it. He looked at Sierra directly. He'd want her to have you as a mother. Someone strong enough to fight for her. Someone who chose to have her and raise her even when it was hard. Jin would have been proud of what you've done. The words broke something in Sierra. She'd spent 4 years believing Jin had abandoned her. That whatever they'd had wasn't real. But maybe it had been real. Maybe he'd left because he'd loved her. Not because he hadn't. Maybe every choice he'd made had been about protection, even if it was the wrong kind. I need to make a decision, Sierra said. About whether Zadie stays connected to this family. Whether I let you all be part of her life, or if I try to disappear again. You can't disappear, Dae said gently. They know about her now. Too many people know. The only question is whether you accept our protection while you figure out what kind of life you want to build. Or whether you try to do it alone and hope no one comes looking. He was right and Sierra hated it. Hated that her choices had been stripped away. Hated that she couldn't just go back to being a waitress with a daughter and a tiny apartment and a simple, struggling life. That world was gone. This was her reality now. If I agree, Sierra said slowly, if I let you be part of Zadie's life, I need things to be clear. I'm her mother. I make the decisions about how she's raised, what she's exposed to, what she's told. You can be family, but you don't get to dictate her life. Agreed, Dae said immediately. And I need safety. Real safety. Not just promises. I need to know that if I'm bringing her into this world, you can actually protect her. Done. We'll move you to a secure building, provide security. Make sure no one can get close without us knowing. I need financial stability. I can't go back to waitressing, not if there's danger. I need a job, something legitimate, where I can support myself and Zadie without being dependent on you. I'll put you in charge of managing one of our legitimate businesses. Good salary, normal hours, health insurance. You'll earn your keep, but you won't have to worry about rent. Sierra studied him, looking for the catch. Why are you agreeing to everything? What do you really want from us? Honestly, I want my mother to have a reason to wake up in the morning. She's been dying slowly since Jin was killed. Having a granddaughter, having a piece of him still alive in the world, it's brought her back to life. That's worth everything to me. Dae's voice was thick with emotion he wasn't quite hiding. And I want Zadie to know she's not alone. That she has family who will fight for her. Who will kill for her if necessary. Sierra understood. This wasn't about control or obligation. It was about grief and love and the messy, complicated ways families tried to take care of each other. The Kwons were offering what they had: money, power, protection. In exchange, they wanted connection. A child to love. A reason to believe their sacrifices meant something. Okay, Sierra said finally. We'll try. But if at any point I think this is hurting Zadie more than helping her, if I think she's being pulled too far into your world, I reserve the right to pull back. To set boundaries. Fair enough. Dae extended his hand. Sierra shook it, sealing an agreement that terrified and relieved her in equal measure. Over the next 6 months, Sierra built a new life. The Kwons moved her and Zadie into a secure apartment in a building they owned. Not the penthouse, somewhere middle ground. Nice but not ostentatious. With actual heat and locks that worked and neighbors who nodded politely but didn't ask questions. Dae gave her a job managing one of their legitimate real estate holdings. It was real work, not a fake position created to funnel her money. She had to show up, had to perform, had to earn her salary. It gave her dignity, purpose, control over her own life, even as she accepted help. Mrs. Quan became a regular presence. She'd video call twice a week to talk to Zadie, teaching her Korean words and songs. She'd visit in person once a month, bringing gifts that were thoughtful rather than excessive. She never tried to replace Sierra, never implied she could do better. Just loved her granddaughter with a fierce, protective devotion that Sierra recognized because she felt the same way. Zadie flourished. The trauma of the kidnapping faded gradually with therapy, another thing the Kwons paid for without making Sierra feel like she owed them. She learned about her Korean heritage, learned that her daddy had been complicated, but had loved her even though they'd never met. She had security, resources, family, things Sierra never could have provided alone. But Sierra also maintained boundaries. Zadie didn't attend Quan family business meetings. Wasn't exposed to the darker side of what they did. Didn't meet the uncles who worked enforcement. She knew her family had money and power, but she didn't know how they'd gotten it. That would come later when she was old enough to understand, to make her own choices about who she wanted to be. Sierra went back to school. Got her GED first, then enrolled in community college. Business management. Because she'd learned something valuable during those weeks with the Kwons, she was smarter and stronger than she'd ever given herself credit for. She'd survived things that would have broken other people. And now, with actual support, with resources and stability, she could become more than just a survivor. The eviction notice that had terrified her 6 months ago was a distant memory. She had savings now, security, options. And while she sometimes mourned the loss of her simple, struggling life where the problems were straightforward, even if they were hard, she couldn't deny that this was better. Not perfect, not uncomplicated, but better. The Russians kept their distance. Word had spread in that world about what happened to people who threatened the Quan family's children. Volkov had pulled back entirely, focusing his operations on different territory. The war that had started with Zadie's kidnapping had ended with a clear message. Some lines you didn't cross. There were still threats. Still danger. One night, security stopped someone suspicious lurking near Zadie's school. Another time, they intercepted a photographer who'd been trying to get pictures of her for reasons no one quite understood. But each threat was handled quickly, quietly, before it could escalate. Before Zadie even knew she'd been in danger. And gradually, Sierra learned to live with it. The constant low-level anxiety that came with knowing your child was visible to dangerous people. The trade-off of accepting protection from people who lived in shadows. The compromise between safety and simplicity. 6 months after that night in the warehouse, Sierra stood in her new apartment kitchen making breakfast while Zadie practiced Korean, counting with her grandmother over video call. The morning light came through windows that overlooked the Philadelphia skyline instead of a brick wall. The kitchen was bigger than her entire previous apartment. The refrigerator actually stayed cold. Small things. Normal things. Things that shouldn't have felt revolutionary but did. "Mommy, Halmiani says I'm getting really good at Korean," Zadie called from the living room. She'd taken to calling Mrs. Kwon Halmiani, grandmother in Korean, with the easy acceptance of a child who'd always wanted extended family. "That's wonderful, baby." Sierra flipped pancakes, watched them brown perfectly. She'd learned to cook properly in the past 6 months. Had time to cook properly, rather than surviving on whatever was fastest and cheapest. Her phone buzzed with a text from Dae. Security picked up chatter about a new crew asking questions about Jin. Nothing specific, nothing threatening. "Just wanted you to know we're monitoring it." 6 months ago, a text like that would have sent Sierra into panic. Now she just typed back, "Thanks for the heads up. Keep me posted." This was her life now. Constant awareness. Constant vigilance. But also constant support. Constant backup. She wasn't alone anymore in protecting Zadie. Wasn't carrying everything by herself. After breakfast, Sierra walked Zadie to school. The new school, the private one where teachers actually had time to help students who were struggling. Where the building wasn't falling apart. where Zadie was learning French and violin and things Sierra had never had access to as a kid. 2 security guards followed at a discreet distance. Sierra had stopped noticing them weeks ago. At drop-off, Zadie hugged her tight. "Love you, Mommy." "Love you too, baby. Have a good day." Sierra watched her daughter run into the building, backpack bouncing, laughing with friends. She looked happy, adjusted, thriving. Was this the right choice? Sierra still asked herself that question every day. Still wondered if the trade-offs were worth it, if the safety was worth the compromise, if she'd made a deal with the devil or just accepted help from complicated family. She didn't have a simple answer. But she had Zadie safe and loved and provided for. That had to count for something. Later that night, after Zadie was asleep, Sierra sat in her new apartment's living room and pulled out the photograph. The one that had started everything. Zadie on the swing, caught mid-laugh, looking so much like her father that it still made Sierra's chest ache. She'd kept it folded in her wallet all these years. A reminder of why she fought so hard. Why she kept going. Now she had copies of this photo all over the apartment. Zadie on the swing, Zadie with her grandmother, Zadie with her Uncle Dae, Zadie just being a kid without the weight of legacy and danger and complicated family history. Just a little girl who'd gotten a second chance at having more than just her mother fighting for her. Sierra's phone buzzed one more time. "Mrs. Quan. Thank you for letting me be part of her life. You gave me back my son in a way. I will never forget that." Sierra typed back simply. "She's lucky to have you as a grandmother." And it was true. For all the complications, for all the danger and compromise and moral ambiguity, Zadie was lucky. She had a mother who would do anything to protect her. A grandmother who loved her fiercely. An uncle who'd taken a bullet for her. A family that, for all its darkness, took care of its own. Was it the life Sierra would have chosen? No. But it was the life they had. And she was learning slowly to be grateful for it. To see the gifts alongside the costs. To understand that family was always complicated, always messy. And you either accepted people as they were, or you spent your whole life alone. Sierra Martinez, who'd collapsed in a restaurant 6 months ago thinking her life was falling apart, had learned something valuable. Sometimes falling apart is what has to happen before you can build something stronger. Sometimes losing control is what teaches you that you never really had it. And sometimes the thing you fear most, letting dangerous people into your life, is exactly what you need to survive in a dangerous world. She wasn't naive anymore. Didn't believe in fairy tales or perfect solutions. But she believed in her daughter. In her own strength. In the strange, complicated family that had claimed them both. And for now that was enough. The photograph went back in her wallet. Sierra turned off the lights and went to check on Zadie one more time before bed. Found her daughter sleeping peacefully, safely, in a room with locks that worked and windows that didn't rattle and heat that came on when it was supposed to. Small things. Everything. This wasn't the end of their story. There would be more challenges, more threats, more impossible choices. But they would face them together. Not alone. Never alone again. And maybe that was what Jin had wanted all along. Not perfection. Not simplicity. Just someone strong enough to protect his daughter when he couldn't. Someone brave enough to accept help even when it came from dangerous places. Someone who would fight for Zadie the way he would have fought if he'd known she existed. Sierra had become that person. Had grown into the mother Zadie needed her to be. And if that meant living with moral complexity, with security guards and video calls with grandmothers who'd seen too much violence, with the knowledge that her daughter's last name carried weight and danger and protection all at once, well, Sierra had survived worse. She'd survive this too. They both would. Because that's what family did. The real kind, the messy kind, the kind that showed up when you needed them even if they weren't perfect. They survived. Together. And in the darkness of her daughter's bedroom, watching Zadie sleep with Jin's face and her fierce determination, Sierra finally allowed herself to believe they might actually be okay. Not perfect. Not simple. But okay. And sometimes okay was enough. So you made it to the end. You watched Sierra's entire journey. From that collapse in the restaurant to finding her strength. From losing her daughter to getting her back. From struggling alone to accepting help from the most complicated family imaginable. And now I need to ask you something. If this story moved you, if you felt something watching Sierra fight for her daughter, if you understood the impossible choices she had to make, then I need you to do something for me. For Sierra. For every parent out there fighting battles no one sees. Hit that subscribe button. Not for me. For the next story. For the next person whose life got turned upside down and had to find a way through. Because these stories, they matter. They matter because they show us that survival isn't pretty. That strength comes from accepting help. That family is more complicated than fairy tales suggest. And the only way I can keep telling these stories is if you're here with me. So subscribe. Turn on notifications. Be part of this community that believes real stories about real struggles deserve to be heard. And one more thing. Drop a comment and tell me. What would you have done? Would you have accepted the Quan's help? Would you have run? Would you have fought? Because I read every single comment. And I want to know your truth. Maybe your answer will help someone else facing an impossible choice. Thank you for watching. Thank you for staying till the end. And remember what Sierra learned. You're stronger than you think. Even when the world tries to tell you otherwise. Even when you're exhausted and scared, and don't know how you're going to make it through another day. You're stronger than you think. And you're not alone. Never alone.